welcome to my first episode of Exploring the Renaissance in Assassin's Creed 2. This is the first episode, Saint What's-His-Name. So let's begin. I will be going over all 30 artworks as available in the 2009 Assassin's Creed 2 game. I will be going in chronological order to the best of my ability, and therefore we begin today with Saint Chrysogonus, a name I will butcher. So, Saint Chrysogonus was painted by Michele Giambono in the 1450s. It is oil on wood, and it was painted most likely in Venice. The first thing you should know about this artwork is that it is an altarpiece, a devotional image used for prayer in the Catholic Church. This has a long tradition dating back to the earliest days of Christianity, and is even continued today. In this case, we are praying to Saint Chrysogonus. And as the name suggests, it would usually be somewhere on the altar or near the altar. Now, what's interesting about this is that while it's the 1450s in Renaissance Italy is really starting to take hold, it's getting its own style, but not everybody's on board. So, for example, Michele Giambono here is still painting in this older style. This is medieval Gothic. Now, I'm not an expert on the Gothic period, but the medieval Gothic dates from about the 12th century up until the Renaissance, and it is most famous for its architecture, like Notre Dame, and illuminated manuscripts. So how do I know that this is a Renaissance artwork that was painted in an older Gothic style? Well, there are three reasons. Number one, the obscure saint. Okay, I'm sure I'm not the only one who had never heard of this guy before. And that is because he probably was only popular in a certain part of Italy during the Middle Ages for a certain amount of time. If you know anything about the Middle Ages, you'll know that they loved their saints. There were so many. It didn't matter what illness, what injury, what cause you needed to pray for, there was a saint, probably several, that could do the job for you. But as the Renaissance kind of gained traction, saints kind of took a back seat. They weren't gone necessarily, but prayer in particular really returned to Christ, Mary, the Trinity. So while there were certainly saints still present in these artworks, you'll see them in other ones, they're not center stage like this guy here. So he's an obscure saint. I'm not even sure we know exactly what his patronage is. But from the looks of things, he's probably a crusader knight. So someone who defends the faith is probably not a terrible guess. Number two, as to why this is an example of Gothic art. Well, the lack of realism, the lack of depth. So the Renaissance popularized, invented one-point perspective, and this relates back to math and science, and depicting the world in the most accurate and realistic way. And that really became a mark of pride for Renaissance artists. But here, if you look at Michele Giambono, he's not really concerned with that, because in the Middle Ages, they weren't really concerned with realism either. It was an artwork. It wasn't supposed to be real. For example, if you think of illuminated manuscripts. Now, illuminated manuscripts are usually pages from prayer books. These were very popular things to own in the Middle Ages. They were personal prayer books illustrated by monks. And depending on how wealthy you were, you could get one that was more illustrated or less. But regardless, the theory at the time was that art was the poor man's Bible. So for so many of European peasantry, they were illiterate. Many of them also could not even understand the Latin that was being said in the church. So art was really their only way to interpret the Gospels. So when monks and artists did create art pieces, they made them as clear and as obvious as possible. So, for example, in this one, St. Chrysogonus is literally the center of the artwork. Physically, he's also the largest in the artwork. He's about the same size as his horse, because again, realism doesn't matter. The important part is that we're praying to him, and he's the center of this artwork. When we look at illuminated manuscripts, we see very, very detailed images. Granted, they're not always clear as to what they are, but the monks who illustrated them used every available space. So they weren't concerned with depth or realism because they didn't have the space for it. These were usually small handheld prayer books, and that transferred over into the art world, into the larger arts. You'll see behind St. Chrysogonus that there is a tree line along with the road. This, however, again, it's not so much about depicting the realistic world as it is about identifying the saint. He was most likely a crusader knight, perhaps for pilgrims, so the fact that he's on the road is significant to identifying him. You'll also notice that, again, like illuminated manuscripts, this artwork is very flat. There is an attempt at depth and shadows, but he also kind of resembles a sticker. And again, Middle Ages didn't care about that. They didn't mind. They didn't need their artwork to be a portrayal of the real world. That certainly wasn't necessary with holy images. And that leads us to number 3. Why is this a Gothic image? Well, it's because of the gold. Now, he has a halo. We know he's a saint. But if you look behind him, again, in the distance, there is a gold skyline. This goes back to our lack of realism, but it's also a symbol that we were supposed to interpret as heaven. So if you see other artworks from the Middle Ages, most of the times they don't really have any sort of background. It's just gold. And this is, well, one, gold was reserved for religious artworks because it was so expensive and valuable, but it also was something a bit mystical. This is a man who is a holy person. This is a man who is in heaven. So of course he's not riding under a blue sky like we are. He is in a gold sky, which is heaven. Oh, side note. So I know, as much as I love this game, I don't think the creators put too much thought into the prices of these artworks in game. Not that they needed to, but it's interesting that this piece in particular is one of the first you can buy. It's one of the first because it is the cheapest. I find that really quite interesting, just because that this is an example of a style that fell out of fashion. So to say that this artwork would have been on the sale rack, it's not untrue. But that just made me happy. So even though most of the style is medieval Gothic, it is a Renaissance artwork. So are there elements where Michele Giambono tried to be a bit more contemporary? Yes. And specifically, there are 2. The first instance that tells me that this is indeed a Renaissance artwork, even if it is painted in an older style, is 1, the colors. So this painting is so bright. Not just from the gold, but the bright reds, the browns, the greens. This is a very old piece. It's hundreds of years old, and it's still so bright. And that is due to the amount of trade that was occurring in the Renaissance specifically. Trade was really at its height. Trade between all throughout Europe and the Middle East was very vast. They traded everything from cloth to spices to pigments. And if you were lucky enough to live in a port city like Venice, Italy, you had first dibs at the best materials. So the fact that these colors are still so bright, even after all these years, that tells me that he lived in Venice during a time of high trade, because it's just such a beautiful, colorful artwork. The second clue that he did attempt some sort of new style is the medium itself. So medieval manuscripts and traditional medieval altarpieces would have usually been painted in tempura. Now, tempura is a medium where you take pigment and raw egg whites, and that's your basis for your paint. And if you think of egg whites, that's protein, that's sticky. Okay, it's going to bind very quickly to whatever surface it's put on. So that really changes how you paint. Whereas this newfangled medium that came down from Northern Europe in the Renaissance, oil paints, this offered a completely different style of painting. You could really take your time, you could add layers, and depending on how much, you could really play around with everything. And so the way people painted changed as well. Here, Michele Giambono is using this new medium called oil paints, but he doesn't know what he's doing. Between oil paints and tempura, a good analogy would be in makeup. If you think of, or paint, matte paint, that would be tempura. Whereas glossy, that's oil paints. And to go further with the makeup example, when you had tempura, you couldn't really do a lot of blending. It was kind of more layering. That doesn't mean you couldn't do a really good job, but it was about building colors on top of each other. Whereas oil paints really allowed you to blend, allowed you to get sfumato, whereas a really kind of blurriness between two colors, which again is what really kind of took hold in the Renaissance and became such a popular art style. Tempura didn't go away, by the way. It's still popular throughout the Renaissance, and I imagine that's just because it was more readily available and much cheaper. Also probably safer to breathe, because oil paints are not safe to breathe. Here we are at the end of the first episode. Thank you for watching. This is St. Chrysogonus signing off. Did that make sense? I don't know.